So thank you for that introduction, and I'm very happy to be here today. One slight modification, Cherkizovo group, but very close. We get that quite a bit. So a little bit more about the company itself. Cherkizovo is actually Russia's leading meat and feed producer within Russia. So we're the largest agricultural holding and #1 ranked Russian meat producer. We have a fully integrated system that evolves all the way from our crop production, feed milling, live production, meat processing, marketing, and distribution. And that's for 3 different species. So we're currently ranked #1 for poultry production, #2 for pork production, and #3 for turkey production. And as you can see on the graphic on the right, we grow about 204,000 hectares of crops, and that would take care of most of our basic ingredient production for our feed mills, which we have 9 of. Last year, we produced about 237,000 tons of pork within the country, and that's from 16 sow production facilities. So, prior to my moving to Russia, I would honestly say I would need a geography lesson right about this time, and so I'm going to offer that. Russia is a very, very large, expansive country, and as you can see on the map, we're located in an area that's been known to be ASF endemic for multiple years. Cherkizovo actually operates within a smaller region in Russia as a whole. I would consider it a very large region when I start driving across it, but in perspective, it's a very small region. And it's called the Central Black Earth region, located here. So the next map I'm going to throw up here is ASF history in Russia from 2007 to 2019. All the dots that you have on your screen are different documented cases of ASF within the country. The red dots on this screen are going to be commercial production or backyard production that has been documented. And the blue dots on the screen are different cases of wild boars that have been tested positive for ASF. So over the years, we've had a peak that has occurred in 2016, 2017, and since then we've started to decrease the number of cases that are being seen in the country, and a lot of that is due to some mitigation efforts that have been put in place to control some of the smaller backyard producing farms that may not have the biosecurity procedures in place, and also an extensive amount of work to control the wild boar population. Again, to reference where Cherkizovo operates in this zone, I'll throw up another circle. So you can see here, we are fairly lucky is that we don't have a whole lot of breaks in our immediate vicinity, and the breaks that we do have would be documented cases primarily of backyard producers, and most of those cases that you actually see within this circle are old cases prior to 2017. So as you can imagine, Russia's history with ASF, we have a lot of veterinary regulations that are in place by the government. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time covering all of these, but one of the 3 of the most important ones are compartmentalization, regionalization, and then electronic health certificates for all movements. This includes feed production, live animals, carcasses, meat. Everything has to have a health certificate prior to being moved. What I'd like to draw your attention to is the Compartment 4 status. It is the highest level of biosecurity and provides some protection against restrictions during disease outbreaks. Currently, Cherkizovo has all of their sites with the exception of one that's an old Soviet-style barn that we're working to replace as a Compartment 4 status. So again, given the history of ASF in Russia, very strict containment protocol in place, and as it sounds, very similar to what is happening in China. So a confirmed positive location will have immediate euthanasia of all pigs on the premise. And then following that, there'll be burning and burial of the carcasses, followed by the extensive washing and disinfection protocols that were discussed. Overall, there will be a 1-year time period without any pigs on the farm, and part of that is a 60-day bioassay period where you're going to have sentinel animals located within the farm. Furthermore, the first hazardous zone is within the 1-kilometer radius of the affected zone. We'd have immediate euthanasia or slaughter of any animals within this zone, with any large commercial production within this zone being able to go to slaughter plants, and that's only used for boiled sausage or canned pork. There will be some exceptions made for Compartment 4 status within that zone that are not interacting at all with that affected site. There's forbidden movement of pigs in and out of that first hazardous zone and restricted movement of people and vehicles. So last year, Dr. Gustavo Lopez did a wonderful presentation on Cherkizovo's history with ASF. So again, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this. The clinical story would be similar to what had been seen in China and just previously presented by our last speaker. What I will say is that we had extensive losses from both of these breaks, and we've increased the focus on biosecurity and internal infrastructure to help prevent future breaks. We've also invested a lot of money in a company-owned laboratory to help centralize some of our testing and actually expedite some of the results. So as I mentioned, since those two major breaks, Cherkizovo has put together an ASF action plan. Due to the devastating nature and the fact that we can't afford to have future breaks, we initiated this plan to help prevent future breaks that may occur. So this action plan is initiated when we are notified that there is a ASF break within 15 to 20 kilometers of our farms. It involves extensive communication with security, transport, logistics, sales, our veterinary team, feed, and live production. So any farms within a 15-kilometer zone will go into what we call a voluntary Cherkizovo quarantine. This is not required by any government regulation, but it's something we've chose to put in place. Any employees which live within a 15-kilometer zone of the break will also be evaluated as part of this plan, even if they don't live in a farm that's next to the break. So anyone that listened to me speak yesterday, biosecurity, we consider it being all about the people and layers, a lot of layers. So people intrinsically make mistakes, and we have to have layers in place to make sure that the mistakes that are made don't cost an entire farm. So instead of spending time on the previous breaks, I'm going to give you a little bit of a scenario of a scare that we had last year. So it happened in September 4th of 2018. One of our regional veterinarians was contacted by a local veterinary authority in an off-the-books sort of manner with a nearby ASF suspect case. A sample had been tested positive in a local state lab and had a suspicious mortality on the farm. So they needed to send the tests off for confirmation at the Russian Scientific and Research Institute of Animal Health in order to issue a quarantine. Those tissues had already been collected and submitted, and they were pending results the following afternoon. We knew we had farms very nearby, so we immediately began mapping. So I hope everyone can see this. This is a drawing or a map of the area where we would have had an ASF break, and it's indicated by the red star. This was the case that was reported to us, and we have two modules of farms basically that sit nearby this. On the right, we'd have a module that operates independently of the other. It's a 6,000 head sow farm with the downstream nursery and accompanying two finishing farms. And then we'd also have the exact same setup, a 6,000 head sow farm, a nursery, and two finishing farms on the left-hand side. So you can see the farms on the right were within about a 30-kilometer radius of our ASF-affected zone. And so we felt that these were fairly safe farms, although we still took some extra measures. But our Module 7 on the left we thought was at high risk, and we took some additional measures to help protect those farms. We also have an internal truck wash located there in the center between Module 5 and our ASF-affected zone. And we actually did some additional measures for that truck wash as well. So on the day that we were informed of this, September 4th, we immediately had new delivery routes that were issued to all of our drivers. So this included both feed supply delivery and all live haul trucks. All trucks were issued new routes to and from the truck wash, and we also segregated all transport between the two modules. The client sales were also immediately canceled, and I'll explain that in the next slide. All mortality removal from the nurseries and finishers was temporarily canceled. At this point, we did have incinerators on both sow farms, so that wasn't a concern, but we did still have centralized collection areas where we were removing mortality from the nurseries and finishers. Because of the concern that there may have been mortalities removed from the ASF site, we didn't want to have any crossover between any of our mortality removal areas, so we did temporarily suspend that mortality removal collection. All of our employees in Lippitt South, which is this region that we're talking about, received additional biosecurity instruction by a production manager in person, and all of our contractors in the region were immediately banned any entry into our sites. primarily because we didn't know where they had been with any certainty, and we were also concerned that they lived in the region and may have received some infected meat products. So as I said, I would explain a little bit more. We currently outproduce our slaughter plants, and so we occasionally have to market some clients to third-party sales. We already have a fairly biosecure process set up for this, and it involves transfer stations at all of our farms. So in the circle, you can see a transfer station that's set up along the fence line of our site. And we would then back up a client truck to that transfer station. Prior to any third-party trucks coming near our sites whatsoever, they first make a stop at our truck wash, get proclaimed free of any organic material, and then additionally disinfected if they pass the initial exam. Prior or after we would back up the truck, we would have the normal loadout procedure of a pig cart moving pigs to the transfer station and then across the transfer station and into the trucks. We would have a person designated to that transfer station that wouldn't go back into the barn, and we wouldn't have any drivers or third-party clients stepping onto that transfer station. We still felt this was a risk because we would have those client trucks coming to our truck wash, and we would additionally have the possibility of trucks that we didn't know where they had been backing up to our farms, and it was just too risky. So we canceled those transfer stations and third-party client sales from the area. So again, back to our map, we do have feed that comes in from the lower right-hand corner of the screen. So from the southeast, we would have feed that comes in from about 200 kilometers away. We would have our feed mills set up, delivering feed to both of these locations. We also have our markets, which are now being designated off to our slaughter plants, and we actually designated new sites to be sold to third-party clients that weren't in the region. So we'd have our markets then heading up to the northeast. And then finally, we'd have wean pig movement. So both of these sow farms have actually outproduced their current standard module. So we have to move additional wean pigs off to a new wean to finish site, which is located about 70 kilometers north of here, to be commingled there to just handle the overproduction from our sow farms. So if we look a little bit closer then at Module 7, this will give you a little bit better indication of just how far our farms were from this ASF foci. So our closest farm would be our nursery, which is the triangle listed here, just 4 miles away. Our sow farm sits off quite further from the farms at about 10 miles away, and then we would have the two finishers that are also basically right next to the nursery at 4.3 miles away. Our truck wash then would be about 5 miles to the northeast and would also be within kind of a hazardous zone for us. So at this point, we knew we wanted to put these sites under quarantine measures to help prevent those employees from being trafficked back and forth to the nearby village and potentially bringing an ASF contaminated anything back to our farms. So the following day, on September 5th, we instituted the quarantine procedure for our LIPIC 7 module, and we immediately began purchasing the necessary supplies. So our purchasing department immediately jumped on that, and by the end of the day, we had cots and bedding ready to go, additional sanitary items such as shaving kits, toothbrushes, that sort of thing that would normally not be on the farm, and some luxury items. So we had the needs of cigarettes, reading material, and additional first aid kit items such as painkillers and that sort of thing. We also began arranging 3 meals per day into our sites, so we do normally cater into all of our sites on a day-to-day basis anyways, so we had to increase that to 2 additional meals, and also provide additional fruits and veggies and snack items to these farms. Later in the day, as I said before, we decided that the truck wash, actually where the employees lived, was in close enough proximity, so we did put those 2 employees at our truck wash under quarantine as well. So back to our ASF action plan, I'll draw your attention to the last point, which is any employees that live within that 15-kilometer radius of the break will also be evaluated as part of the plan. Unfortunately, when we draw that circle back around our ASF outbreak, we get very close to our Module 5, which we felt those sites were in a further enough distance away that they were protected, but we did have employees that were transferring back and forth between the village that was affected and Module 5. So in total, we ended up placing 37 employees on quarantine, and then 5 employees from Module 5 were actually sent on vacation as part of our procedure to help prevent them from going back and forth from the affected village to our farms. Further, on September 5th, again, just the day after we heard about the break, we updated and issued a ASF reinforcement plan. And again, this is a program we already have basically in place. It just needs to be re-updated each time we have a new break for specific details of that break. So we increased our rodent baiting around these sites. We actually added an additional secondary rodenticide at the same time. Occasionally we'll have issues where our rodenticide seems to not be quite as effective, so we would add a new product to the scheme to help prevent some of the rodents around the sites. The site territories were also mowed and sprayed for ticks. We had fly control reinitiated in the barns anywhere it was necessary, so we had additional flies in the barns, then we would spray for them. We also did a control of any birds on the sites and bird proofing of all the sites. For sanitation, we increased the changing of our disinfection barriers to once a week. Normally that's done every 2 weeks, but we went ahead and increased the changing of that to once a week. We increased the concentration of our disinfectant in our boot mats that are at the security checkpoint, which all of our employees are required to step on upon entering the site territory in their personal shoes. We also additionally added hand sanitizer to the security checkpoints of Module 5 due to the fact that we knew we had clinical signs in this farm that were probably underreported prior to us actually getting a report. We had concerns that some of that meat may have made it into the local market, and so we asked all the employees to dispose of any meat which they had locally purchased from their markets within the past week. That was the reason for the additional hand sanitizer. We thought, hey, maybe we can have a chance of people coming in that have recently handled meat, and before they ever enter our checkpoint, we'll just disinfect their hands as a precautionary procedure. Continuing forward, we restricted movements of semen into the region, so our semen delivery actually comes again from about 150 kilometers away, and so we restricted that to 2 times a week delivery to Module 7, and we also did we changed the order of our transport to go to Module 5 first, followed by Module 7. We also increased to a daily washing of that transport car, again, hoping to limit the amount of contact that we had between that region and our completely unaffected regions. We also instituted unplanned checks of the canteens, providing the meals to the farms. So this is part of their contract anyways. They have to allow us to come in and do a security check to make sure that they don't have any pork products on site. And then finally, we also did increased monitoring of all the farms. So we increased to weekly monitoring on all farms, and then any abnormal health signs resulted in an immediate test as well. We postponed our wean pig movements from the wean to finish site momentarily until we were able to review the situation, and we also instituted a review of the video surveillance of the sites for the past week. So further communication from the authorities on September 5th, we were notified that our farms would not impose any restrictions as they fell outside the first hazardous zone, and our farms are all compartment 4 status, which means we also didn't suffer any restrictions in the second hazardous zone, which is a much larger area, and we would fall within. On September 6th, the official quarantine was actually issued for the location. At that point, as I'd mentioned before, there's immediate movement restrictions of all agricultural animals in that first hazardous zone, and the euthanasia of the positive site and all pigs within the 5-kilometer zone was initiated. There were only other animals that were in that 5-kilometer zone were backyard pigs. On our side, again, on September 8th, we had no clinical signs present in any of the farms, and no breaches in biosecurity were found upon reviewing our surveillance. So we just made the decision to go ahead and resume movements to that wean to finish site. Ultimately, our nurseries had taken more animals than they should have, and so we were able to then move to the wean to finish site with pretty sure confidence that we at least had our quarantine measures in place and we were moving negative animals out. As I'd mentioned, we'd already done additional testing measures on anything that was suspicious, and we'd only had 2 additional suspicious tests, and those were because of heightened awareness, not something we would normally test on. From September 4th to the 20th, we had daily live calls with our production team to review any peculiarities in the situation. So we talked about the comfort of employees, health status, and any biosecurity concerns that they may have. Finally, on September 19th, we received information that all the animals had been disposed of and the first washing and disinfection of the premise had occurred. So in total, there was about 4,000 animals that were euthanized, and 152 of those heads were actually reported to be the backyard pigs within the 5-kilometer zone. So Cherkizovo did maintain the quarantine until September 23rd. We'd actually planned to hold that quarantine for 1 week following the last disinfection, just because we knew that there was probably meat within the area that still needed to be consumed, but we did go ahead and release 2 days early. So what does it cost? In our scenario here, I've just thrown up some of the numbers that we would have for the cost of just the quarantine itself. For us, purchasing bedding, cots, toiletry, etc., amounted to about $2,800. Salaries above the norm, we were required by Russian legislation to pay our employees for 16 hours. So we did have double the salary cost for those employees, and that extra above the norm salary cost was about $27,000. Again, food above the norm because we had to bring in 3 meals instead of just 1. We had additional food expenses, which was only about $7,600. We did not have any additional transport costs because we were not transporting employees back and forth from the site due to the quarantine. We didn't have any additional transport for the food coming in. It ended up zeroing out. So in total, we had about $38,000 that were spent on this quarantine, which amounted to 37 employees and 19 days of quarantine. So cost per person per day was about $54. So, back to the question, is it worth it? I'll bring you back to our history with ASF. In our first case, it was a very extensive case, and that amounted to about a $30 million loss. In our second case, it was limited to 1 sow farm, and that amounted to about a $6.8 million loss. I would say that a $38,000 insurance policy sounds like a pretty good deal to me. Thank you, and I will answer any questions at this time.
Any questions for Amelia? Good. Good job.
Very well done. Curious how you're testing African swine fever, both from a surveillance standpoint and an outbreak standpoint.
Yeah, so our routine testing procedure is a little bit different from our sow farms to our nurseries and finishers. We put a lot of testing emphasis on our sow farms, and our primary means of testing would be via serum. We also do some tissue sampling as well. Requirements within Russia is for spleen samples to be submitted routinely as well as blood samples, so those would be the 2 primary tissue or testing types that we would do. We do routine monitoring weekly on all of our sow farms, and we actually have a decreased protocol for our nurseries and finishers. We do test any clinical signs that show up that may be suspicious. All of our veterinarians know that that's an immediate test procedure that they need to do.
Question over there?
My question's about 3 and 1. What's the prevalence of the backyard pigs in Russia, feral pigs, and the ornithodoros tick, and what risks are they to your systems?
So, to my knowledge, we don't have any of the soft-shelled ticks in our area. Again, we go ahead and spray just based off of the fact that we could have other transmitting vectors that we can control, so we do spray for ticks routinely. Backyard production is very extensive in the villages where all of our employees would be from. So we do have requirements that none of our own employees are allowed to own backyard pigs, but when we have security go check their premises, a lot of the villages will have backyard pigs in them. In terms of what percentage that is of the production, I'm not really certain. We do have major producers within the country. Like I said, Cherkizovo is the second largest, and we have 85,000 sows. So there would be one larger than us, but most of the systems that are currently operating, due to the expensive nature of having ASF breaks, the government has started to try to decrease the number of small backyard farms in the area. So I know that's decreasing, but I don't know the percentage currently.
Is there going to be any national eradication effort in Russia in the future, do you think?
So again, it comes back to that cultural issue. There have been programs put in place to try to buy pigs from these villages and replace those animals with either beef or sheep or chickens, something else to provide some substance to the families. So there is efforts to try to control those backyard pork populations, and I think that would be the first step in trying to put an eradication effort together, but it's going to take a lot of cultural change before that's going to happen. And as you can see, even with wild boar reductions, we still have a lot of cases of wild boar infections. We do have biosecurity measures because of the compartment status that do prohibit a lot of that contact with the wild boars, but until we get rid of the backyard small producers who are the lower compartment status, I don't think there'll be a program put in place anytime soon.
One more question, or more, whatever, at least one more.
What steps have they taken to control the feral pig population in Russia?
So there's an open hunting, hunting regulations are controlled in Russia, but other than that, there's no restrictions on hunting wild boars. So if you have a gun and you have a hunting license, you're free to take care of those. There have been eradication or cleanup protocols that they've tried to do as well, but to my knowledge, they're mainly focused on private sector trying to contain the wild boar population.
Anyone else? Okay.
On your wild boar population, do the licensing for hunting require them to submit sample out of those animals to see the prevalence in the wild boar population?
You'll have to repeat that, I'm sorry.
And the boars that are shot, does the government test the boars for ASF?
Yeah, so any animals that are shot or any that are found dead, they are tested, and so that would be the reason there's a larger number of cases. So any animals that are shot, found dead, or part of their normal hunting would be tested if those are chosen to be submitted. Of course, some people are not submitting samples, they're just choosing to hunt and kill those animals, but there would be free testing in place for any animals that are found.
Okay, very good. Thank you, Amelia.